The heat in Redemption, Arizona, was not an element of the weather. It was the foundation of existence. It shimmered over the baked earth street, rose in waves from the tin roofs, and settled in the lungs like fine dust. It was a dry, oppressive heat that promised no relief, only a deeper thirst. For Jake Riley, the heat was a constant companion in the rhythmic inferno of his blacksmith shop. The roar of the forge was his sermon, the clang of his hammer, his prayer, and the sweat that dripped from his brow, his penance. For 5 years this had been his life, a deliberate monastic routine designed to beat the past out of his memory, one glowing piece of iron at a time. He worked with his back to the town, a wall of muscle and leather between himself and the world he no longer belonged to. The town of Redemption was a quiet place, a single dusty street squinting under the vast, indifferent blue of the Arizona sky. It was a town for people who were either starting over or giving up, and Jake had never been quite sure which category he fell into. He kept to himself his words as sparse as the desert rain, his gaze fixed on the work in front of him. He was the town blacksmith, a man of function, not of history. And that was just the way he wanted it. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the street when the peace was shattered. It began not with a bang, but with a sudden, unnatural silence. The lazy drone of flies, the distant nicker of a horse, the murmur of conversation from the general store, it all ceased at once. Jake's hammer faltered mid-swing. He held the hot iron over the anvil, his head cocked, every nerve long, dormant, suddenly awake and screaming. Then came the explosion of glass. The window of the Redemption Bank, directly across from his smithy, erupted outwards in a crystalline spray. A woman screamed a sound, cut brutally short. The silence that followed was heavier, more terrifying than the noise itself. Jake dropped his hammer, the clang echoing the sudden violent lurch in his gut. He moved to the wide-open doorway of his shop, his body shielded by the thick timber frame, his eyes scanning the scene. 4 men, their faces covered by bandanas, spilled out of the bank. They moved with a chilling efficiency, not the frantic scramble of common thieves, but the disciplined grace of soldiers. One stood guard on the boardwalk, a sawed-off shotgun held with casual menace. 2 others emerged, dragging heavy canvas bags. The 4th man, clearly the leader, walked out last. He was tall and moved with an unhurried confidence that was more frightening than any weapon. He wore a fine black coat, strangely formal against the dust and grime, and even with a bandana covering his face, his eyes were visible, cold, intelligent, and utterly in control. The town was frozen. People peeked from behind curtains and dived into doorways. From his office down the street, old Sheriff Brody appeared, his hand hovering uncertainly over the Colt at his hip. He was a good man, but he was 20 years past the kind of fight that had just arrived on his doorstep. Jake watched his hands clenched into useless fists. He was unarmed. His own gun belt, the one that had been a second skin for over a decade, lay buried in a wooden chest at the foot of his bed, a relic of a dead man. He felt a familiar, sickening helplessness rise in his throat, the impotence of a protector with nothing to protect with. He could only watch as the outlaws mounted their horses, the bags of money slung over their saddles. The leader, Silas Kane, swung into his saddle with a fluid motion. But he didn't leave. He turned his horse to face the blacksmith shop, his gaze seeming to pierce the shadows where Jake stood. For a long, deliberate moment, their eyes met across the sun-scorched street. A shiver cold as a grave traced its way down Jake's spine. This was no random robbery. Then Silas did something that stopped Jake's heart. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object that glinted in the unforgiving sunlight. It was a silver locket, oval-shaped, with a delicate floral pattern etched onto its surface. Silas held it up for a moment, ensuring it was seen. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the middle of the street. It landed in the thick dust, with a soft puff, a tiny gleaming accusation. Jake knew that locket. His breath caught in his chest, a ragged, painful gasp. The world around him dissolved into a roar of blood in his ears. The heat, the dust, the fear hanging over the town, it all vanished, replaced by the ghost of a memory he had spent 5 years trying to bury. He saw a woman's face smiling, her hand clutching that very locket. He heard a child's laughter. He smelled the smoke of a burning farmhouse. Silas Kane gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of chilling intimacy. Then he spurred his horse, and he and his men thundered out of town, leaving behind a violated bank, a terrified populace, and a past that had just been violently resurrected from its grave. Jake Riley, the blacksmith, stood trembling in the shadows. But it was U.S. Marshal Jake Riley who stared at the silver locket lying in the dust, his carefully forged piece shattering into 1,000 razor-sharp pieces. In the aftermath, redemption felt like a town holding its breath. The outlaws were gone, but their presence lingered like the bitter smell of gunpowder. Townsfolk emerged, slowly gathering in hushed, frightened groups. The bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, babbled incoherently about the money, but his eyes were wide with the terror of having stared down the barrel of Silas Kane's pistol. Sheriff Brody, his face pale and etched with the deep lines of age, finally holstered his unused weapon. He was a man made for settling disputes over stray cattle, not for facing down disciplined killers. His deputy, a younger, eager man named Ben Evans, scurried about taking notes and trying to project an authority he clearly didn't possess. Jake remained at the edge of the chaos, his gaze still fixed on the locket. It lay there like a poisoned star, drawing all light and hope into itself. Finally, he moved. He walked out into the street, his heavy work boots sinking into the dust. Each step was a lifetime. He knelt, his knees cracking, and picked up the locket. It was warm from the sun, but it felt cold in his hand, cold as the memory it held. He didn't need to open it. He knew the tiny portraits. It contained a smiling woman named Sarah Miller and her husband Daniel. "What is that, Jake?" Sheriff Brody's voice was gentle. He had walked up behind him, his boots silent in the dust. Jake closed his fist around the locket, the delicate etching digging into his calloused palm. "Nothing," he rasped, his voice raw. "Just something they dropped." He turned and walked back to his smithy without another word, and the weight of the silver locket in his pocket heavier than any hammer he had ever lifted. Inside, the fire in the forge was dying, its orange glow fading to a dull red. He slumped onto a stool, the world outside receding to a dull murmur. 5 years ago, he had been Marshal Jake Riley, a man known for his relentless pursuit of justice. He'd led a posse after a gang of rustlers, tracking them to a remote homestead. His intelligence had been wrong. The rustlers were gone, and the family living there, the Millers, were innocent farmers. But his deputies were keyed up, green and jumpy. A lantern was knocked over. A shadow moved. A shot was fired. In the chaos of smoke and fear and bellowing confusion, Daniel Miller had emerged from his house with a hunting rifle, trying to defend his home from the armed men descending on it. He was cut down in a hail of panicked gunfire. The fire from the lantern spread to the house. Sarah Miller ran out screaming for her husband, for her young son. She was caught in the crossfire, a stray bullet finding her heart. Jake had pulled their little boy Thomas from the flames, but it was too late. The family was gone, destroyed by his mistake. He had resigned his commission the next day, the silver star feeling like a brand on his chest. The locket had been found in the ashes, clutched in Sarah Miller's hand. He had held it for a week before burying it with her, a secret token of his monumental failure. And now it was back. Silas Kane wasn't a random outlaw. He knew. He had somehow retrieved that locket from a forgotten grave. This robbery wasn't about money. It was about Jake. It was a message written in glass and terror delivered directly to the doorstep of his self-imposed exile. He spent the rest of the day in a haze, mechanically cleaning his forge, the familiar tasks failing to soothe him. He saw the faces of the townsfolk who passed his door, Sheriff Brody's daughter Emily, her face pale as she swept broken glass from the boardwalk in front of her father's office. Maeve, the saloon owner, standing in her doorway, her arms crossed her sharp eyes, missing nothing. They were good people living simple lives, and he had brought this plague upon them. His past wasn't just his own anymore. It had followed him here, and it had guns. That evening, as a bruised purple twilight settled over the desert, Sheriff Brody appeared in the doorway of the smithy. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of weary respect. "Jake," he began, his voice tired, "I need your help." Jake didn't look up from the piece of metal he was pointlessly heating in the forge. "You need a marshal." "I'm a blacksmith. There's no time to get a marshal from Prescott. By the time he got here, Kane and his men would be in Mexico. You know this country. You know how to track." Brody took a step inside. Those men, they weren't common thugs. They moved like an army. "I'm out of my depth here, Jake, and I'm not too proud to admit it." Jake pulled the glowing iron from the coals and plunged it into the quenching barrel. Steam hissed violently, filling the small space with a sulphurous smell. The sound was the scream he couldn't release. "I'm not that man anymore, Sheriff," he said, his voice flat and hard. "That man is dead." Brody stood in silence for a long moment. He looked at the powerful set of Jake's shoulders and the deep lines of grief carved around his eyes. He had always known there was more to his quiet blacksmith than met the eye a history kept under lock and key. "All right, Jake," he said softly, disappointment heavy in his voice. He turned to leave. "I won't ask again." After the sheriff was gone, Jake stood alone in the growing darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the forge. He had built this life, this quiet, empty shell, to keep the ghosts at bay. He had convinced himself that laying down his gun was an act of atonement. But seeing that locket, feeling its cold weight in his hand, he understood the truth. Hiding wasn't atonement. It was cowardice. He hadn't paid for his sins. He had just run from them, and they had found him. He walked to the small room at the back of the smithy and knelt beside his cot. Reaching underneath, he pulled out a long, flat wooden chest, coated in a thick layer of dust. He ran his hand over the lid, then slowly opened it. Inside, nestled in worn felt, lay his past, a Colt peacemaker, and a gun belt, and the leather oiled and supple, cared for, even in exile. The silver star of a U.S. Marshal lay beside it, tarnished with neglect. He ignored the star. He lifted the gun belt, the familiar weight of it settling in his hands. It felt like an extension of his own arm, a part of him he had tried to amputate. He strapped it around his waist, the buckle cinching with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He was a blacksmith, yes. But the man who had created Silas Kane's vengeance was a marshal. And it was a marshal's job to finish it. The sun was barely a crack of blood red on the eastern horizon when Jake walked into the sheriff's office. Brody was asleep in his chair, his head slumped on his desk, next to a stack of paperwork. He jerked awake as Jake entered, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "Jake," he mumbled, blinking the sleep from his eyes. He saw the gun belt at Jake's waist, and his expression changed. Relief and apprehension warred on his tired face. "I'll track them," Jake said, his voice devoid of emotion. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "But I'm doing this my way. This isn't about the town's money. It's personal." Brody looked at the locket, then back at Jake, a question in his eyes, but he didn't ask it. He just nodded. "Whatever you need." "I ride alone," Jake stated. "You and Evans stay here. Protect the town. Kane might double back, or he might have left someone behind to watch." Just then, Deputy Evans came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He was young, with a face that hadn't yet settled into the hardness of the West, and an ambition that shone too brightly in his eyes. He stopped short when he saw Jake, his gaze immediately dropping to the Colt peacemaker. You're going after them?" Evans asked, a flicker of excitement in his voice. "I'll ride with you. We can—" "No," Jake cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The sheriff needs you here." Evans's face fell, a flash of resentment clouding his features before he masked it with a professional nod. "Yes, sir. Of course." He placed a coffee on Brody's desk and offered the other to Jake. Jake ignored it. He was already turning to leave, his mind focused on the trail ahead. He trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him that the deputy's eagerness felt wrong, like a counterfeit coin. He rode out of Redemption as the town was just beginning to stir, a solitary figure, moving west into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert. The landscape was a canvas of muted browns and pale greens, stretching out to a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. The sun climbed its heat, becoming a physical weight on his shoulders. This land was indifferent to the passions of men, to their grief and their vengeance. It simply endured. Finding the trail was easy. Kane hadn't been trying to hide it, not yet. He was confident, arrogant even. But as Jake followed the tracks of the 4 horses, he saw the signs of discipline he'd noticed during the robbery. The horses were kept at a steady ground-eating pace, not a panicked gallop. They rode in formation, avoiding terrain that might lame a horse. These were not desperate men. They were professionals executing a plan. By midday, the heat was a suffocating blanket. The silence of the desert was profound, broken only by the plod of his horse's hooves and the creak of saddle leather. It was a silence that invited ghosts. The face of Sarah Miller shimmered in the heat haze. The sound of her son's crying echoed in the whisper of the wind through brittle sagebrush. Jake pushed it all down, focusing on the tracks on the mission. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Late in the afternoon, the trail led him into a series of rocky canyons, the red stone walls rising up on either side, amplifying the heat. It was perfect terrain for an ambush. Jake dismounted, proceeding on foot with his Winchester in hand, his horse trailing behind. He moved with a predator's quiet, his eyes scanning every shadow, every ledge. He heard it before he saw it, the soft scuff of a boot on gravel from a ridge above. Jake dropped behind a boulder an instant before a rifle shot cracked the air, the bullet whining off the rock near his head, showering him with stone chips. A rear guard. Just as he'd expected. He didn't fire back. He remained perfectly still, listening, letting the echo of the shot die. Another shot kicked up dust a few feet to his left. The shooter was trying to flush him out. Jake stayed put, his breathing slow and steady. He was no longer a blacksmith. He was back in his element, a world of life and death geometry. He marked the man's position by the muzzle flash. High to his right, he waited. The sun beat down. Sweat trickled into his eyes, stinging. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. The ambusher, impatient, shifted his position, dislodging a small cascade of pebbles. It was all Jake needed. He rose, fired, and dropped back into cover in one fluid motion. The shot was instinctual, a calculation of angle and distance made in a heartbeat. He didn't hear a cry, only the heavy, final thud of a body hitting the rocks, followed by the clatter of a rifle tumbling down the slope. Jake felt nothing. No triumph, no remorse. It was simply a problem that had been solved. He cautiously made his way up to the ridge. The outlaw was young, his face frozen in a mask of surprise. Jake searched his pockets, finding nothing but a few coins and a half-empty pouch of tobacco. He stood for a moment, looking out over the vast, empty landscape. This was the first bloodshed. He knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones that it would not be the last. Silas Kane wanted more than to see him dead. He wanted to make him bleed first, to strip away his new life, piece by piece, until the only thing left was the monster from the past. Jake left the dead man where he lay for the buzzards and continued on the brief, violent encounter, sharpening his senses. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He found the outlaws' camp just before dusk. It was tucked into a small, defensible box canyon, a single entry and exit point. A small fire was burning, but the camp was empty. They had moved on, and recently, they had left something for him. Propped against a saddle near the fire was a child's doll. It was crudely made of sackcloth and yarn, its button eyes staring blankly. Jake's blood ran cold. It was the doll that belonged to the miller's son Thomas. He remembered the boy clutching it as Jake carried him from the burning farmhouse, the only thing the child had left in the world. How had Cain found it? Had he tracked the boy down? The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. This was a new level of cruelty. Silas wasn't just reminding Jake of his failure. He was twisting the knife, making him imagine fresh horrors. He picked up the doll, its worn fabric soft in his hand. He was no longer just hunting a man. He was hunting a demon who wore his own past as a mask. He made a cold camp miles away, eating dry biscuits and jerky, unwilling to risk a fire. The desert night was a blanket of profound darkness, the stars scattered across the sky like chips of ice. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a maelstrom of fire and screaming of Sarah Miller's accusing eyes and the weight of a small, sobbing boy in his arms. He rode back into Redemption the next afternoon, exhausted and grim. The doll was tucked securely in his saddlebag. He needed supplies, a fresh horse, and information. He needed to know if word of a man matching Silas Cain's description had been heard anywhere in the territory. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Brody and Evans were there, poring over a map. "Find anything?" Brody asked, his gaze hopeful. "I found their rear guard," Jake said, his voice flat. He didn't elaborate. He laid the sackcloth doll on the desk. Brody looked at it confused. "This is a message," Jake explained. "He's telling me this is about more than the bank." Deputy Evans picked up the doll, turning it over in his hands. "Just a piece of trash, looks like. Maybe a kid in his gang dropped it." "He doesn't have a gang of kids," Jake said, his eyes locking with the deputy's. "And he doesn't make mistakes." Evans shrugged, putting the doll down. "Well, while you were out chasing ghosts, I was doing some real police work. Got a wire from the marshal in Tucson. A fella fitting your man's description, tall, fancy coat, was seen asking about travel routes south. My guess is he's making a break for the border. Heard a rumor from a prospector that a band of outlaws matching their number were holed up near Coyote Canyon. Good place to lie low before running for Mexico." Jake listened, his expression unreadable. The information felt too easy, too clean. Coyote Canyon is 40 miles east. They were heading west when they left here. "Decoy," Evans said with a confident smirk. "Throw you off the trail. It's what I'd do." Jake didn't argue. He just nodded slowly. "Maybe." He gathered a few provisions from the general store, ignoring the suspicious looks from some of the townsfolk. The story of the robbery and his involvement had clearly made the rounds. To them, he was no longer just the quiet blacksmith. He was trouble that had come to call. That evening, he went to Maeve's saloon. The place was subdued, the usual boisterous noise replaced by nervous murmurs. Maeve was behind the bar, polishing a glass with a steady hand. She was a woman in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that saw more than they let on. She poured Jake a whiskey without him asking. "On the house," she said. "You look like you need it." Jake downed the drink in one go, the burn, a welcome distraction. "You've got the look of a man wrestling with a ghost," Maeve observed, her voice low. "I've seen it before. Hope you win." "The ghost is winning so far." Jake admitted the words, tasting like ash. It was more than he'd said to anyone in years. "Ghosts feed on silence," she replied, her gaze steady. "Sometimes you have to shout them down." He left a coin on the bar and walked out into the cool night air. Maeve's words echoed in his mind. He had been silent for too long. The next morning, he rode out again. He headed east toward Coyote Canyon. He knew it was likely a wild goose chase, but he had to be sure. He also knew that if Evans was lying, letting the deputy think he'd taken the bait was his only advantage. The canyon was, as he suspected, empty. He wasted a full day confirming it. The rage that simmered inside him was cold and patient. Evans wasn't just ambitious, he was complicit. Jake didn't ride back to redemption. He cut south, circling around to pick up Silas Kane's original trail. He was a day behind, but his purpose was now crystal clear. He wasn't just hunting Silas, he was hunting a traitor. And he was done letting them lead the dance. He found the trail again where he'd left it, the tracks now a day and a half old. He pushed his horse hard, the urgency a spur in his side. He was no longer the pursuer. He was the one being played with a pawn in a game whose rules only Silas Kane seemed to know. The knowledge chafed, rubbing raw against the wound of his pride. 2 days later, he got his break. He spotted a lone rider on a distant mesa, his silhouette stark against the setting sun. The man was watching the back trail, another rearguard. But this time Jake had the advantage of surprise. He spent the better part of an hour circling around, using the terrain and the deepening shadows to mask his approach. He came up on the man from behind, dismounting, and closing the final 100 yards on foot. The outlaw was careless, humming a tuneless melody to himself as he scanned the wrong stretch of desert. Jake got the drop on him easily. The muzzle of his Colt pressed against the man's temple before he even knew he was there. "Don't move," Jake's voice was a low growl. The man froze, his hands slowly rising. He was wiry, with shifty eyes that darted around looking for an escape that wasn't there. "Silas Kane, where is he headed?" Jake demanded, disarming the man and binding his hands with a length of rope. The outlaw just sneered. "He'll kill me for talking. You'll just kill me if I don't. Don't see much of a choice there." "He's not here." "I am," Jake said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And I'm not feeling patient. He's going to redemption, isn't he? He's doubling back." Fear flickered in the man's eyes, a confirmation more potent than words. "You don't know Silas," the man stammered. "This ain't about money. It's a lesson. He's a teacher, see, and you're the star pupil." "What lesson?" Jake pressed, yanking the rope tighter. The man winced. "The one about reaping what you—" He never finished the sentence. A single sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the distance. A red flower bloomed on the outlaw's chest. His eyes went wide with shock, a gurgle escaping his lips, and he collapsed into the dust. Dead. Jake reacted instantly, diving for cover, as another bullet kicked up dirt where he'd been standing. He peered over the rock, scanning the ridge from where the shot had come. He saw him. A lone rider, already turning his horse to flee. Even at this distance, the set of the man's shoulders was unmistakable. Deputy Ben Evans. The shot had been perfect, a marksman's kill from over 200 yards. The deputy wasn't just a source of bad information. He was one of them. An inside man. A killer. Rage pure and undiluted surged through Jake. He raised his Winchester, drew a bead on the fleeing figure. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it right here, one clean shot. It would be justice. But he lowered the rifle. Killing Evans out here in the desert would solve nothing. It would make him a wanted man and leave Silas Kane free to continue his game. No Evans had to be exposed. He had to be taken back to redemption and made to face what he'd done. Jake stood over the body of the second dead outlaw, his breathing ragged. He finally understood the full scope of the threat. It wasn't just Silas and his crew. The rot was inside the town itself. He couldn't trust anyone. He was utterly, completely alone. He rode back toward redemption, a grim purpose hardening his face into a mask of stone. He felt like a man walking into a cage, knowing the trap was about to be sprung. As he neared the town, a stagecoach thundered past him, heading in the opposite direction. The driver, a man he recognized, gave him a nervous glance, but didn't stop. An hour later, Jake entered Redemption's main street. The atmosphere was different. The air was thick with tension, and the sky to the west was a bruised, sickly yellow. A storm was coming. A big one. The new deputy, a young man hastily sworn in by Brody, met him outside the sheriff's office. He handed Jake a letter. "Stage driver said to give this to you. Said a man paid him to deliver it." The envelope was crisp and the handwriting on it elegant and precise. It was addressed simply to Marshal Riley, his old title. He tore it open. The message was short, the ink a stark black against the white paper. Asterisk, the harvest is coming to redemption. A storm is on the horizon. I trust you'll be there to meet it. S.K. The game was over. The final confrontation was here. Silas wasn't running to Mexico. He was coming back, and he was using the approaching sandstorm as his cover. The storm rolled in, not as rain, but as a solid wall of ochre dust that swallowed the horizon. The sky darkened, and the wind began to howl a low, mournful sound that scraped at the nerves. It whipped sand into the air, stinging any exposed skin and finding its way through every crack and crevice. Redemption battened down its hatches, windows shuttered, doors barred. The world shrank to the confines of four walls. Jake felt the town's fear like a physical presence. But his own fear had been burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He knew what was coming. He also saw how Deputy Evans was using the growing panic. He moved through the town, his voice calm and reasonable, sowing seeds of distrust. This trouble started when Riley got involved, he'd say to a group of men huddled in the general store. He's like a lightning rod drawing the storm right to us. The whispers followed Jake wherever he went. The gazes of the townsfolk, once wary, were now openly hostile. To them, he was the source of their terror, the man who had brought Silas Kane and his demons to their doorstep. He was isolated, a pariah, in the very town he was trying to protect. He found Sheriff Brody in his office, struggling to pin a map to the wall against the drafts that snaked under the door. "He's coming, Brody," Jake said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "He'll use the storm for cover. We need to gather everyone, put them in the most defensible building in town." The saloon. Evans, who had been standing by the window, turned. "Now you're just trying to spook people, Jake. They're long gone. I told you they were headed for Mexico. You shot a man in the back from 200 yards to keep him from telling me you were lying," Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. Evans' face paled, then hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about. I saved your life." "Did you?" Jake took a step closer. "That's enough, both of you." Brody snapped, stepping between them. He looked from Jake's granite certainty to his deputy's flustered denial. He was old, but he wasn't a fool. Doubt was creeping into his eyes. "Ben, go check on the south side of town. Make sure every door's barred." Evans hesitated, then shot Jake a look of pure hatred before leaving. "You believe me?" Jake asked Brody quietly. "I believe the old sheriff," said, his voice heavy, "that I don't know what to believe anymore. But Maeve's saloon is built of stone. It's the safest place. Get people moving." Jake went to the saloon. It was empty, save for Maeve, who was calmly lighting lanterns as the world outside grew darker than dusk. The wind rattled the windows in their frames. "They're coming, aren't they?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jake replied. "Get people in here. Bar the doors. Keep this shotgun under the bar." He slid a loaded greener across the polished wood. She took it, her movement steady. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going hunting," he said. He slipped out the back door of the saloon, just as the storm hit with its full blinding fury. The wind screamed, and the air was so thick with sand that visibility was reduced to less than an arm's length. It was like moving through a nightmare. This was Silas Kane's world now, a world of chaos and confusion. He could hear them before he saw them, the muffled thunder of hooves, men's voices calling to one another through the gale. Silas and his men were infiltrating the town, just as he'd predicted. They were heading for the saloon where the town's heart was gathering in terror. Jake didn't go to the saloon. He went to the livery. He knew Silas would leave a man to watch their horses. He moved like a ghost through the swirling dust, finding the stable hand tied and gagged in a stall. And at the far end, holding the reins of 4 horses, was one of Cain's men. Jake came up behind him, the howl of the wind masking his approach. A single sharp blow from the butt of his pistol, and the man went down without a sound. 1 down. He crept back out into the maelstrom. The saloon's windows glowed faintly through the dust, a beacon in the chaos. He circled around to the back to a small cellar door he'd noticed before. He slipped inside into the cool, musty darkness and made his way up the stairs, emerging into a small storage room behind the bar. He could hear voices from the main room, the frightened whimpers of townsfolk, and the calm, commanding tone of Silas Cain. He peered through a crack in the door. The scene was a tableau of terror. Silas stood in the center of the room, his black coat dusted with sand, his bandana down. He was handsome with a cruel, charismatic smile. His men held the townspeople at gunpoint. Sheriff Brody was on his knees, his face ashen. And beside him, holding a pistol to the sheriff's head, was Deputy Evans. Emily Brody, the sheriff's daughter, cried out, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. "It's over, old man," Evans sneered at Brody. "Your town belongs to Mr. Cain now." His motivation was plain on his face, greed and the petty thrill of power. Silas's eyes scanned the room, then stopped, a look of disappointment on his face. "But where is our guest of honor? I went to all this trouble." Surely he wouldn't be late for his own party. And then Silas looked directly at the storeroom door, as if he could see right through the wood. "Come out, Marshal Riley, or the girl dies first. Then her father. I'll unmake your new life, one piece at a time." The moment had come. Jake pushed the door open and stepped out, his Colt steady in his hand. "Let them go, Cain. This is between you and me." Silas smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, in the sudden silence, each tick a hammer blow against the tension. The wind howled outside, rattling the very foundations of the building. "You don't remember me, do you?" Marshal Riley. Silas said, his voice silky smooth. "You wouldn't. I was just a boy hiding in the hayloft watching. But I remember you. I remember the day you led your brave posse to my brother's farm. Daniel Miller, an innocent man. You and your trigger-happy deputies burned it to the ground and called it justice." The words hit Jake harder than any bullet. Silas Cain was Thomas Miller, the little boy he had pulled from the fire, the child whose entire world he had destroyed. The sackcloth doll wasn't a threat. It had been a memento. His own. "My name is Silas," he continued, his voice losing its smoothness, replaced by the jagged edge of a lifetime of hate. "My mother gave me that name after you took everything else. I watched you murder my father. I watched you murder my mother." Jake's throat was dry. He couldn't deny it. The townspeople stared at him, their fear now mingled with shock and accusation. He was the monster. He was the reason this was happening. "It was a mistake," Jake whispered the words, feeble, pathetic. "A terrible mistake." "A mistake," Silas laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "It was a massacre. And a man reaps what he sows. I am your harvest marshal. Now you get to feel what it's like to lose everything." He nodded to one of his men, who grabbed Emily, pulling her in front of him as a shield. Starting with the girl, the world narrowed to the space between them. The ticking clock, the howling wind, the terrified faces, it all fell away. It was just him and the ghost he had created. A ghost who was now pointing a gun at an innocent girl's head. Jake had a choice. He could be the killer Silas believed him to be, or he could be the man he was trying to become. He dropped his gun. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. "You win, Silas," he said, raising his hands. "Let them go." Silas stared, momentarily thrown. This wasn't part of his script. But just as a flicker of confusion crossed his face, Maeve acted. She kicked the greener shotgun she'd hidden behind the bar. It slid across the floor, stopping right at Jake's feet. In the same instant, Jake dove for the shotgun as all hell broke loose. Maeve overturned a heavy table providing cover for the hostages. Brody, seeing his chance, tackled Evans, and the two men crashed to the floor. Jake came up with the shotgun, the twin barrels looking like cannons in the dim lantern light. He fired one barrel into the ceiling, the blast deafening. Plaster and dust rained down. Silas's men, disoriented, fired wildly. Jake used the chaos, firing the second barrel, the buckshot taking down the man holding Emily. She scrambled away to safety behind the bar with Maeve. It was down to Silas. He stood, his pistol aimed at Jake, his face a mask of pure rage. "You will die for what you did," he screamed over the ringing in their ears. He fired. But Jake was already moving, throwing himself over the bar. The bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. From the floor, Sheriff Brody, having subdued Evans, fired his own pistol. The shot went wide, but it made Silas flinch. Jake rose from behind the bar, his empty shotgun useless. He and Silas were 10 feet apart. Both men were out of bullets. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two sides of the same tragic coin. Then, with a roar of pure primal hatred, Silas lunged. The fight was brutal, desperate, and ugly. It wasn't a gunfight of the West. It was a brawl in the dirt. They crashed over tables, their fists finding flesh and bone. Jake was stronger, but Silas was fueled by 15 years of rage. Finally, Jake got Silas in a hold, his arm wrapped around his throat. Silas struggled, his fingers clawing at Jake's face. "Kill me," he choked out. "Finish it. Be the animal I know you are." Jake looked into the eyes of the boy he had wronged, now a man twisted by a need for vengeance. Killing him would be easy. It would be an end. But it would also be a final victory for the ghost of Marshall Riley. "No," Jake grunted, the word torn from him. He tightened his hold until Silas went limp, unconscious, and let him fall to the floor. He stood breathing heavily, his body aching, his soul shattered. He had won. But it felt like the most profound loss of his life. As the wind outside began to die down and the survivors in the saloon looked at him, their faces a mixture of gratitude, fear, and a new terrible understanding. As the sandstorm abated, a fragile, dusty light filtered through the saloon's grimy windows. The silence inside was as heavy as the air outside, broken only by the whimpers of the frightened and the ragged breathing of the exhausted. The townspeople slowly emerged from behind overturned tables, their eyes fixed on Jake. He was no longer the quiet blacksmith or the fearsome gunfighter. He was a man laid bare, his tragic past exposed for all to see. Sheriff Brody, his face bruised, but his resolve firm, hauled a bound and gagging Deputy Evans to his feet. "You betrayed this town," Ben Brody said, his voice shaking with a quiet rage. "You betrayed the badge." He shoved him toward the door, into the custody of two townsmen who had found their courage. Emily rushed to her father, her arms wrapping around him in a desperate hug. When she pulled away, her eyes found Jake's. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a deep, sorrowful empathy. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake could only nod, the words caught in his throat. He turned his attention to Silas, who was beginning to stir on the floor. Jake knelt and checked the man's bonds, ensuring they were secure. Silas's eyes fluttered open, filled with a defeated, burning hatred. "You can't escape what you are, Riley," he rasped, his voice raw. "No," Jake said, his voice steady for the first time. "But I can choose what I become." He stood and turned to Brody. "He'll stand trial. For the robbery, for the killing. The law will see to him. By choosing to bring Silas in alive, Jake had made a definitive statement, not just to the town, but to himself. He would not answer vengeance with vengeance. He would not become the killer Silas had tried to prove he was. In the days that followed, redemption began to heal. The bank was repaired, the glass replaced. The rhythm of life, though shaken, slowly returned. But something had fundamentally changed. The town knew Jake's story now. They treated him with a new kind of respect tinged with awe and a certain distance. He was their savior, but he was also a man with a dark and bloody past. Jake welcomed the distance. He returned to his smithy, to the familiar comfort of the forge and the hammer. He worked tirelessly, the physical exertion a balm for his wounded spirit. He was forging more than iron. He was trying to forge a new man from the broken pieces of the old one. A week after the storm, he walked to the small sun-bleached cemetery at the edge of town. There was no grave for the Millers here, no stone to mark their tragic end. He found a quiet spot under the shade of a lone twisted mesquite tree. The desert wind whispered through its branches. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching out. He didn't speak aloud, but in the quiet of his own heart, he finally said the words he had carried for 5 years. He acknowledged his guilt, the full, crushing weight of it. He apologized to the ghosts of Daniel and Sarah. He asked for forgiveness, not from a God he wasn't sure he believed in, but from the memory of those he had wronged. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the graves, he felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside him. The burden wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But it was a burden he could now carry, rather than be crushed by. When he returned to his shop, the town's new deputy was waiting for him. He was a young, earnest man handpicked by Brody. He held out a letter. "This came for you on the stage, Mr. Riley." The envelope was thick and bore an official seal. Jake opened it, his hands stained with coal dust. It was from the U.S. Marshal Service. Word of his actions in redemption had reached Prescott. The letter spoke of his courage, his adherence to the law under extreme duress. It spoke of second chances. At the bottom was a formal offer, full reinstatement of his commission, a pardon for any past indiscretions, and his old life back. The Silver Star was his for the taking. He stared at the letter, at the offer of a return to the man he had been. It was a path to a different kind of redemption, a validation from the world he had left behind. For a moment he was tempted. He looked up from the letter and out at the town. He saw Sheriff Brody making his slow, steady rounds. He saw Emily watering the flowers in the window box outside the general store. She looked up and gave him a small, genuine smile. He saw Maeve sweeping the boardwalk in front of her saloon. He saw a town that was quiet and flawed and scarred, much like himself. A town that he had, against all odds, come to care for. He walked back to his forge, where the coals glowed with a deep orange heart. He held the letter, the offer of his past, over the heat. He watched as the edges curled, turned brown, and then burst into flame. The paper turned to black ash, crumbling into nothingness and drifting up into the chimney. He picked up his hammer. The weight was familiar, comforting. He took a piece of heated steel from the forge and placed it on the anvil. The ringing sound of his hammer striking the iron was strong, steady, and rhythmic. It was the sound of a man not erasing his past, but forging a new future piece by piece in a small, dusty town called Redemption.